Okay, so we are recording the webinar today. Anyone who has registered will receive an email with a link to the recording and also to the slides, so you can come back and rewatch, or for those who registered but didn't make it, you'll be able to watch back at a later date. So today we will talk a bit about how to get credit and recognition for method development. So this is really a core part of the research process, and it's one which has fallen a bit behind in terms of being able to be recognized for their efforts and seeing methods as an important research output in and of themselves. I am Emma Ganley, and Director of Strategic Initiatives at Protocols.io, but have a background initially as a researcher and then worked in research publishing in an editorial capacity for about 15 years. So before joining Protocols, was chief editor at PLOS Biology. So I've thought a lot about publishing and research and what constitutes research and the different pieces that make up research. And so we will quickly just step back to do a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording the webinar, as I just said. There will be time for a Q&A at the end, but if you have a question along the way, feel free to add that to the Q&A or the chat. And if I spot it while I'm in full flood, I'll try and answer it. If not, I'll come to it at the end for you. And you can look at other webinars on our website. And you could also request an individual demo if ever anyone's interested in kind of getting a one-to-one session to go over how to do particular things. So agenda here in brief, we will do a bit of an introduction into methods development and then talk about public sharing of and how to get credit for your reproducible discoverable protocols. And obviously my focus here is on Protocols.io because that's the tool that I'm representing today, but there are some other ways, and I'll show a couple of those ideas of other ways to share methods if we want to do that differently. And really it's about how Protocols.io can improve the reliability and impact of your research papers, and you can turn your protocols into peer-reviewed papers themselves. So we'll get started, excuse me, with a bit of an introduction. So if we go back a little bit in history, the journal Nature Methods was launched in 2004. So a little bit under 20 years ago, not really that long. And the excerpt you can see here is from the inaugural editorial there. So the founding editors stated that their goal was to create a highly visible forum for the presentation of novel methods, because major methodological developments take their roots in the cross-fertilization of different disciplines. As a contrast to this, the normal way of communicating methods, just the methods section, materials and methods of journal articles, although they can be useful for the targeted peer groups in giving a general idea, they generally don't have sufficient technical information or the wide exposure needed to move those towards more interdisciplinary exchanges. I've got a really wonderful example of how that sharing of methods can lead to interdisciplinary exchanges, and a success story there via methods a bit later. Behind the scenes, though, if we go back to that editorial on the launch of Nature Methods, what we learned from Veronique Kierma, who you can see here, she was the founding editor-in-chief of Nature Methods and now is the chief scientific officer at the Public Library of Science. She has told us that there was a lot of skepticism at Nature, even at Nature Publishing Group, around the launch of Nature Methods. They thought that, they publish research and that nobody would read or be interested in just methods. And they were actually concerned that it might dilute their brand, it would just be impossible to fill a journal's pages just with methods. But as we all know, Nature Methods has been and is a thriving success. But it's very interesting to think about, that mindset and consideration of methods as something that might, wasn't necessarily meritorious of independent credit, which was just less than 20 years ago. But tons has happened since then. If we look back even more recently, just in the last 10 years, there have been more and more methods-focused journals that publish protocols and methods. So I've got some examples of those here, but it's not exhaustive. Big publishers like Springer Nature continue to expand their portfolio of method-centered journals like Nature Protocols 2 years after they launched Nature Methods. They also have Protocol Exchange, and they recently have acquired protocols.io. So they've really put a big focus on the sharing of methods now at Springer Nature. Similarly, Elsevier launched Star Protocols and Methods X, but there's all sorts of other independent initiatives like Jove, which is for visualized experiments, so videos, really primarily just videos. There's Brio Protocols and others. So we're now in a place where journals, funders, and a lot of researchers have realized that it isn't just code and data we should be sharing, or the papers. It was in the late 90s and noughties when we started to move away from that contact authors for to using more specialized data and code repositories, all sorts of different repositories available for different kinds of data. And data availability statements started to be commonplace in many journals after the PLOS policy was implemented in 2014. So although methods are playing catch up, sharing them is becoming slightly more the norm, as you can see by the launch of these different journals. And then there's another, I won't go into detail, but there's another form of sharing, kind of methodological approaches and protocols via registered reports. So another article type which splits into two, and researchers submit initially the plan, the study plan, the experiments they'll perform, the question that they're probing and looking to answer. And if the journal reviews just the plan and the question that's being investigated and deems method good, question good, then they offer an acceptance before the research has even been performed. Researchers then go on to perform that study and can publish. They have an automatic in-principle acceptance as long as they stick to what they said, and it becomes not dependent on the results, which is very, very interesting way of thinking about doing research too. So it's basically high quality protocols and method that receive a provisional acceptance for publication. And it's interesting to think protocols.io is a very good location for sharing those kind of study plans, protocol plans, because if there is any change over time, because it has a versioning capacity, you can add new versions and you'll always be able to track exactly what changed from one version to the next. In short, though, here, methods and protocols is becoming something that's really being expected for authors to share alongside data management plans. More and more funders want researchers to say how they will share their methods. The recent, kind of, I guess, last year launched guidelines on open science from UNESCO have noted that they would like researchers to be sharing protocols and methods as well. So there's more and more places where this is coming up. Funders are starting to expect it. Science Europe in their recent set of guidelines include a pointer and a recommendation of using protocols.io. So it is coming and it's something that now is important for researchers as a standalone research output and something that they can get credit for. So I'll move on now to give you some insights into how you can use protocols.io for public sharing and getting credit for reproducible and discoverable protocols. As I sort of alluded to earlier, there's a lot of research outputs that we've been accommodating. We've done well at accommodating some of those for some time. So most well recognized in the center here is the research article, but we now do appreciate much more the value of code and data. Citations are another element. And last but very much not least are the methods. And methods really, if we think about it, are the linchpin to reuse and ongoing value of all the other items here. What do I mean by that? So this is an image I found in a magazine article where someone had made a variety of tiny tweaks to a recipe to bake cookies. So you can see that if these cookies are your data and results from the methodological tweaks are essentially those cookies look and feel and taste, they're phenotypically very different from one another. But scientifically, we can only understand what those, how those phenotypic differences have come about if we have a knowledge of what the method tweaks were that we used to generate each different kind of cookie. In short, you need to know the recipe tweak for a cookie if it the methods are needed alongside the data, and that's very, very important for reanalysis or anything like this. So I think in some ways methods are of equal value to any other part of the research process, and significant amounts of detail are needed to understand what it is that had been changed in that recipe. So this is where protocols.io comes in. We've got a really simple mission to make it easy to share method details before, during, and after publication. If you're not familiar, a really good place to start is the URL here on the bottom left, the protocols.io/welcome. Many people know that it's an open access repository. It actually now has well over 15,000 published protocols. So they're discoverable because they're all open access with CC by license. They're free to read, use, and reuse. Also free to create an account and publish protocols in the protocols.io repository. There are also, though, which is not as obvious, over 62,000 private protocols. So these have been created by users who are working on methods, optimizing, developing, perhaps just sharing with immediate colleagues their protocols. And that's the business model of protocols.io, is we charge institutions for that private collaborative space, like a software license, really, to give the users access to create and generate and work with the tool behind the scenes before they're ready to share. Free accounts only have a limited number of private files. So if you're continually publishing them, the free account gives you most of the same functionality. But stepping back, those public protocols, every year about 1 million people come to protocols.io, the repository, to look, access, read, make use of those public protocols that have been shared and cite them. So they can all be cited. I'll show you that shortly. So it becomes a significant research output. They're also being indexed by various search engines or in other places like Crossref and Google Scholar. If you've linked with an ORCID profile, they will appear as a work on your ORCID profile. So in this way, all of the published protocols are this valuable research output that can allow for researchers to get credit for them. About 60% of all of our traffic to public protocols comes from Google searches. So people are organically searching for a method, finding and using the protocols on protocols.io. Geographically, when we look at the analytics, about 30% comes from the United States. I think it's equivalent amount from Europe, and the rest is really scattered all around the world. So they have global reach as well once they're made available on protocols.io. So I mentioned, you can use it as a public repository. So if you come here, you can search directly if you want to look for a specific protocol that's relevant to you. You can just pop it straight in the search bar on that welcome page, and it will find you results. Actually, the layout's changed slightly now. There's a toggle to pick between these, but you'll find publications or workspaces that have been set up. You probably have your own private workspace, but some are open for all to join. So you can look also for workspaces that represent communities that might be relevant to your research and join those if you want to have an insight into what people are working on in that space and have the ability to interact with researchers who belong to that group. So this is just to show, if you haven't seen before, what a protocol looks like, and it's actually one that has hints on how to make your protocols more findable and discoverable, so you can access this yourself. So you can, as a research article, it's important to include an abstract. You will have a title and can add a thumbnail picture to make that more discoverable. I mentioned work groups, we call these the work spaces now. You can join those. If you add keywords, it makes them much more discoverable as well, because they will come up in searches. It's important to include as much information you can about the tools that you're using, the reagents that you're using, any catalog numbers and so on that come with the reagents. Bioinformatics components, you can add in commands or software packages, data sets, etc. We strongly recommend pictures and videos because You can really enhance the reproducibility of a protocol that way, showing people how to set up, etc. Protocols on protocols.io can be run. So if you include time and other things that will enhance that, you can add single step instructions to make it easier to do click, click, click. And if something's to be repeated, include them as sub-steps as well. Just be concise. It should be an instruction, not a narrative. And yes, include timing for running the protocol, because you can have a timer that runs on the run. And you can create sections. The colored parts here are all the different sections. So you can split up your protocol that way. Guidelines, warnings, safety, etc., etc. There's all sorts of ways to enhance and include a lot of information on the protocols. So I will flip slightly now. I mentioned earlier that there was a great example of interdisciplinary connections that can be made by sharing methods independently from research articles. So this is a really nice example of that. On the top left is a researcher from Chile who is looking for a protocol for RNA extraction from primary cortical neuron cultures. So RNA extraction from brain cells. After a while, a postdoc from UCSF tweeted a reply pointing to a protocol on protocols.io. When you look closely at that protocol, this protocol here, it actually has been included and it goes along with a manuscript on GigaScience, a published paper on GigaScience, which was focused on a 3-spine stickleback parasite, so a fish parasite. This is really unlikely that the researchers working on brain cells cultures would have found this paper on fish parasites as a location for a method that was relevant to them, had it not been for the protocol being published and available as an independent research output. So these authors will get credit for the method in here, and its reuse by these other researchers who will apply it in a completely different context. So you can really understand and see a lot of the other benefits here. Sorry, I seem to have like an extra slide number on many of my slides. Apologies for that. So increases the discoverability, the reproducibility, these amazing research connections between people working in very different fields, enables reuse and enhances the value of the research. And we have some lovely examples from some researchers who've made a lot of use of protocols.io, reporting that sharing and publishing their detailed protocols has directly led to an increase in the number of collaborations they've established, as other researchers have found them through the content that they've made available and published on protocols.io. It's important to note, before I move on to how protocols.io interacts with publishers, that since we launched protocols.io in 2014, and with over 15,000 published protocols, we've never ever come across a case or heard of a case of a publisher saying that because you put your protocol on protocols.io, you can't publish your research or method paper in their journal. So publishers don't consider the publication or availability of protocol publicly on protocols.io as a prior publication. It's much more like posting a preprint. So we've been made aware, we've never been made aware of that hurting authors. So no one has ever been told, no, that won't work. We can't consider your paper. So we would always strongly encourage people to share publicly as soon as the protocols are ready. And from the publishing perspective, sharing on protocols.io gives your method additional visibility, as well as enabling you to engage with the people who are using the method. It can also help better represent the authors involved. So it may be that someone spends a long time developing a method as a part of a PhD or program that they're on, and because it takes such a long time, they never get to apply or actually perform the research. But perhaps there's a subsequent research paper published and they're not listed as a primary author, even though they may have done a majority of the work involved in making that experiment possible because of the method development. But because we can break off into modules, the method and the paper, this means you can have a completely different author list and recognition of different researchers for the method development than from the application of the method to a research question. Here we go. So the next bullet on the agenda to demonstrate how you can improve the reliability and impact of your research papers by either including a call out to your protocols on protocols.io, or by taking protocols you have but have not really published before and turning those into peer-reviewed methods papers. Just a quick overview first of how easy it is to publish a protocol on protocols.io. You will see prominently, if you add a protocol on protocols.io, that when you're editing it, there is a button that says publish. And it's a very quick 6-step process where some information may be required from you, as we do have to ensure minimal fields are completed before we publish. And then if you are somewhere that has a premium license, your protocol will immediately be published. If you don't have a premium license, then it will enter a screening step, as we do check protocols before proceeding to weed out spam. We see quite a lot of random spammy submissions that we definitely don't want to be publishing. So we say that might take up to 2 days. In reality, it's almost always done same day, outside of weekends, holidays, and you get an email like the one here once it's been posted with the DOI. If you don't want to publish and make your protocol fully available before the manuscript that it's going alongside is published, you can use this reserve DOI option that will generate a DOI that won't yet be live, and you'll also get a private link so that you can give editors and reviewers access to the protocol until the manuscript is accepted, and then you can come back and complete the publishing process. We would strongly recommend publish rather than reserve DOI, just because it saves having to come back and toggle it public afterwards. And as we've already said, we've never heard a case of a journal saying we won't consider because you put it on protocols.io already. So what does it look like in a published paper? So if you've posted your lovely protocol on protocols.io, or even a collection of protocols, which you can do, if you've got more than one experiment in the paper, you can make separate protocols for all of them and contain them within a single collection that can have its own DOI. So it means you just have to point to one thing from your research paper. So this example is in a PLOS biology paper. And in the paper, they say, under their materials and methods and protocols for all of the experiments performed are available as a collection in protocols.io. And if you click the DOI, you come to protocols.io. In this instance, those authors have created a new version of one or more of the protocols in that collection, and therefore there's a new version of the collection. But the paper will always link you to the version that was published at the time that the paper was published. But if you come across, you'll always be informed if there's a newer version. So this is, we call this dynamic permanence, because the authors have control to come back, fix errors, make changes if they want to, or just further clarify if something wasn't very clear in a new version of the protocol. And what's great is that if it is a mistake, you don't need to go through the arduous process of a correction at the publisher. And if you click, then you will be brought to the most recent version. You can compare if you want to see what changed between versions. Okay, on to another option. If you've got a protocol already that you've been developing, you've never published it, but actually you realized, oh, this could be perhaps a standalone paper. We have a close relationship now with PLOS ONE. They launched a new article type called Lab Protocols, and that requires the method to be on protocols.io as part of the article and allows authors to publish their methods. So article and protocol are bidirectionally linked, like you can see here. I've got a little video of how that looks as well, if I can get that starting. So when you're on the the PLOS ONE site, you can see that it's a lab protocol, and a prominent link to see the protocol is there. So that's a really nice way of having the DOI and the materials and methods, as we've said before, and this lovely bidirectional link between paper and protocol, which is just a much better format really for a method paper. You can see it's prominently clear, it's been reviewed, and that it goes along with the +1 paper on protocols.io. You can see the versions there if there are any, and the DOI right at the top. And then you just have, you know, lovely protocol with images in, a much nicer way of presenting how to perform this protocol. Include materials, the guidelines that you might have, and you can also view metrics. I'll come back to the metrics a little bit later on as well, because this weighs in with that credit part. You can also see that +1 citation on that paper as well. So we've been publishing those with +1 since the start of 2021. And they've been quite impactful. We've had some lovely feedback from authors of some of those lab protocol papers that I'm showing here. So Monica at the top notes that because her wastewater protocol achieved mass media attention, even being featured in a New York Times article, she became quite famous within her small Latin American country. Just amazing to hear this kind of thing. Jacopo here in the middle, he published the first lab protocol that I showed you just a minute ago. That was his protocol, and he was really excited about it. And I'm going to show you a little bit more from him in a minute. And then finally at the bottom is Simon, and this was his first paper as a senior author, which was also clearly very meaningful for him in his career. So back to Jacopo though, we've been making spotlight videos with several of these authors about the lab protocols they've published. I'm going to show you a clip from Jacopo's where he talks specifically about how this publication and making his protocols openly published part of this work was impactful for him. The audio should come through, so fingers crossed this works.
Hindsight, now that you've started the postdoc, when you look back in terms of the significance of the lab protocol for your career development, and just looking back, you know, hopefully you're not regretting doing this. Like, how do you feel it fit into your PhD and into the postdoc transition and the reception of the lab protocol paper from your perspective?
I'm extremely proud of it. One of the things I'm really happy about is that, of course, it aided me in the completion of my PhD and me getting a PhD. It's one of the things that, in my specific case, my PhD reviewers were really happy about and were really impressed by. So that's a point of honor for myself. But at the same time, I'm really happy of having it done for my own personal PhD, because it sort of gave a methodological section to it. While, especially in anthropology, is usually research project centered. So a context, a time period, a culture, being able to also develop a method and including a more technical aspect to it, I thought it complemented that really well. And although my PhD was specific to a time period and a region, I managed to add this methodological aspect that sort of went past those boundaries. Another really good thing that I think this protocol has done for my career is the recognition it gave me. As Lenny, you were saying, at first it kind of blew up. Many people started following along and were interested and got in touch with me. I was lucky enough to have been invited to lectures and practical sessions at various universities. And for just a standard, quite niche archaeological method, I think the article right now, after a year, has 4 citations in it, and I've heard of people that are putting together the manuscripts and they've been using it as well, and that's something that I'm very proud of, and I think it has helped my career quite a lot.
So you can see that for him it's been very big, instrumental in his career, which is lovely to see. And so just goes to show that sharing your methods can be, you know, just as important for career progress and recognition as other research outputs and like the papers themselves. So important to note that we've been in touch with many publishers over the years, because there's a big push for reproducibility, and also now a better understanding that sharing methods details is important. There are well over 500 journals, publishers, some open access, some subscription, and they encourage authors in their submission guidelines to include in their manuscripts a link to the detailed protocols on protocols.io. Now, whether researchers are reading all of those submission guidelines is never very clear, but it is in there if you look for best practice in a lot of those journal guidelines. And remember, we've said we never had an issue with authors not being able to publish a paper. So not only do journals not see a conflict with publishing your protocols early in protocols.io, they often actively encourage the use of the platform. More and more funders as well have been working with us, some to mandate, others to just encourage, as I mentioned before, kind of protocol methods management plans. How will they share that you should use a tool like protocols.io? And then more and more institutions are taking out those premium licenses for all of their researchers so that you can start to use the tool earlier in the research process and develop things privately before you're ready to share them. Here are just some lovely examples of papers that have been published in the journals promoting deposition of the detailed protocols in protocols.io. So this is the kind of modular publishing, embracing open research, all of those different outputs that we start to see more and more. So paper is still perhaps the centerpiece of the story, but you also may have data in NCBI or OSF or some other repository, code available on GitHub, and more seeing methods going into a repository as well. So this allows, as I said before, for distinct author lists for each of those research outputs, and for credit to be given appropriately to the right people for each of those outputs. So we're definitely seeing more trends in scholarly publishing to move away from a vague materials and methods section that might be a paragraph or two of "we did this experiment" to something much more rigorous and more reproducible by way of method reporting. And just to note, protocols all have their own DOI and a citation. So this is how you can then go to allude to the protocols in other research outputs, either to go alongside the data or within the research manuscript. So in the protocol itself, you'll find a citation under the metadata, and there's a little arrow to the right hand side of it where you can download the citation. This citation can then be imported into reference management software like Mendeley or EndNote, anything that you're using, so that you can cite as appropriate the method as a distinct entity from data or from research article, depending on the context of when you're referencing that prior work. And I mentioned earlier that we come back to the metrics. I showed you it's really easy to look for methods on protocols.io that have been published by others. And so the same would go for your protocols. And what happens is once they're made available as published outputs, others can come in and run them. They can add comments and questions. It becomes a kind of a public FAQ, but they can also make their own forked version. So it's a copy of, but in which you can see the relationship back to the protocol that they've made it from. So you can always track reuse. And then those researchers who've made their own version, they can adapt the protocol for the precise details of their approach. It might be they're doing something similar, but with a different species, or they have different equipment, or there are just ways that they want to try to perform that experiment a bit differently. So when that happens, with lots of options on protocols.io allow you to monitor and track all of the metrics. See on here on the left the number of views. So this is a very well accessed protocol. They won't all be as high as this, but well over 250,000 views of all versions, lots of exports. You can bookmark them, so if you can track and find easily the protocols you want to use by bookmarking them. And this one has 176 forks. A lot of those are private, so other users are making their own versions to work on privately, but some of them are public. And if you click on the forks tab, you can kind of track and view when there are forks, when there are versions, and really see the reuse that's happened for a protocol that's been published on protocols.io. And you can see, a number of comments and run records as well. The run records is not that high, but maybe people are making their own version and then running their own version. So it's in terms of being able to demonstrate value of a shared protocol, once they start to be reused like this, it's very easy to show that using protocols.io. Second to last thing I'll mention before I stop, although we're very familiar with the option of supporting information or supplementary files and documents that go with research articles, there's a really good push for a number of years now to move away from those supplements and to use repositories instead. So if any of you are putting methods details as a PDF supporting information file, it's really recommended not to do that, but to add it to a repository instead. There's a really good article about the reasons behind that in The Scientist here. But in short, it's not findable, it's not searchable. Some journals don't archive those supporting files as well as they do the rest of the paper. So the value add of that PDF supporting information file is very, very limited. And finally, before I stop the Q&A, just to reiterate all of the various different but equally important benefits of sharing and publishing your methods on protocols.io, and how this can be beneficial both to your immediate collaborators and others who may want to access all of the details of your methods, but also to you as a means of being able to receive credit for your research methods. Very final, just to say, your most likely collaborator in 6 months is yourself. So even if you're doing this and you get all of that nice external credit, remember it's also highly beneficial for yourself to have published and made available a public version of all of the details of your protocols this way. And that is me to the end of the slide. So I will flick to Q&A. My email, well, I put it on my video on here too, so anyone can follow up with emails to me as well, but I will stop the screen share. And if anyone has questions, I don't think any came in while I was talking, but feel free to pop them in the chat or the Q&A now, and I can answer them. Or if you don't have any, feel free to drop off, and then we'll go from there. I'll just wait for a moment to see if anybody weighs in. I will stop the recording while we're here too.